called it! Give up the God Hand, now!
Only thing I'm giving up is an ass kicking.
If you look at the earliest stuff on my channel, you'll see videos of my first time fighting God Hand's bosses. Admittedly, they're not that good. I'm too reliant on dodging backwards and using certain moves to set enemies up for juggling. And the entire run was on easy, so the difficulty never went past level 2. Even though I don't like my gameplay in these videos, I've never taken them down because I've always wanted to come back to the game and try my hand at beating it on normal as a comparison point. And I've just gone through God Hand on normal. Again, I don't think my gameplay is remarkable by any means, but I like what I put out now in contrast to my previous run, because it's like opening up a time capsule and looking at a snapshot of myself from years ago. In his Let's Play for Deadly Premonition, Super Great Friend explains why DP is his favorite game.
Have you ever felt like a game was made just for you? Like it was pandering to your own sensibilities and sense of humor? It did something different and you really enjoyed it, but maybe not everyone else got it, but you did and you really liked what it was doing. Well, I felt that way earlier this year when Deadly Premonition was released for the Xbox 360. Deadly Premonition certainly does something different.
That's how I feel about God Hand. I know I've placed all my eggs in Vanquish's basket, but while Vanquish is my favorite game of all time, God Hand is what kids back in the day would say, my aesthetic.
Newsflash, big guy. You can wax on, wax off all you like. I'm still kicking your ass.
I don't think God Hand needs much of an introduction. It's a 2006 character action game on the PS2 developed by Clover Studio and directed by Shinji Mikami. It got a notoriously low score by IGN that gets used time and again to perpetuate the running joke that game journalists are bad at video games. You play as Gene, a guy down on his luck who saves a girl from some thugs, only to realize that no good deed goes unpunished. But it's okay now, because he's got the God Hand, one half of the set of arms that belonged to an ancient warrior that defeated the demon lord Angra so many years ago. Despite his absence, Angra's influence hangs over the land. You see it on the buildings and the people who've resorted to terrorizing the local townsfolk. It's up to Jean and Olivia, the woman in charge of safeguarding the God Hand, to punch through every enemy and defeat the demons in charge of resurrecting Angra, the Four Devas.
Sometimes I think all we do is hold these ridiculous meetings.
I don't know if we can call God Hand obscure anymore. So much stuff is already out there about the game's development and tutorials on how to improve your gameplay. It's hard to put something out nowadays that doesn't just feel like you're treading on familiar ground. But I'm gonna give it a shot. First, some background info. A year ago, Shinji Mikami did a retrospective on his career, from his beginnings at Capcom to taking over the reins at Tango Gameworks. At the time, Capcom had established Clover Studio in-house to be their experimental side of game design. Mikami had just finished directing Resident Evil 4 and wanted to work on a new project while he was writing stuff for Clover. Unfortunately, everyone in Clover was busy working on Okami, so Mikami had to poach staff from Capcom if he wanted to make a game. Capcom was also developing Final Fight Streetwise at the time. Mikami loved the Final Fight games, but didn't like how Streetwise was starting out. And if you've played Streetwise, you can see why. According to Mikami, he wanted to make a game that would appeal only to him and one other programmer on his team. Other people could give their opinions, but he'd have the final say on the matter. He admitted that this was a selfish move on his part because he knew that God Hand would not appeal to a mass market. But since he brought results with RE4, he figured that he could make a game just for the fun of it, instead of worrying about metrics for once. So why are we talking about this? I don't know if any other video on the game has made these points, but I'm gonna say them now at the start. 1. God Hand is a spite game. I don't mean that in a derogatory way. It was made out of spite for Final Fight Streetwise. There's no bigger motivator out there than hating on something and knowing you can do it better. 2. God Hand is an auteur piece. It was made with no intent or consideration for the mass market and only serves to express Mikami's and Clover's sentiments at the time. When people talk about their favorite game directors like Kojima and Ken Levine, David Cage, Jesus, we need more big names here. You can point out that Shinji Mikami also deserves to be part of that discussion with God Hand.
Represent!
And 3. God Hand is Shinji Mikami's Fooly Cooly. He turned the game into a creative outlet that featured everything he loved from pop culture. Hell, the title is most likely a reference to Berserk and a group of demons manipulating events from their pocket dimension, who get parodied in-game by the Devas. Explaining what God Hand is and its appeal is almost as hard as playing the game. If we're being hyperbolic, it's one of the hardest and funniest games ever made. It's a 3D beat-em-up that takes elements from Mikami's previous work, Resident Evil 4. The close third-person camera is pulled back so you can see Jean fill up the screen, but it's still more claustrophobic than what most players would expect from an action game at the time. RE4 featured a dynamic difficulty system. It kept track of certain statistics in the background to determine how to adjust a challenge for each playthrough. If you're good with your shots and at avoiding damage, the game will change the item drop frequency or enemy durability and aggression to up the challenge or lower the challenge if you're getting hit too many times. God Hand took the dynamic difficulty and made it an integral part of the HUD. You always know what difficulty you're at in the game, and the meter fills up or empties out based on how well you perform in combat. Difficulty goes up from 1 to 4, with 4 being called level die, because 4 in Japanese is synonymous with death. And they're not joking, you will die on level die.
Insolent fool!
In RE4, killing Ganados would sometimes cause a plaga to burst forth from where their heads used to be. How often you get a plaga depended on what difficulty level you were at. God Hand's equivalent are what the God Hand wiki calls specters, but I've always referred to them as demons. I love how the game announces their presence by darkening the overall lighting of the area and changing the background music to sound more ominous. Like plagas in RE4, the frequency of demon encounters depended on your difficulty level. God Hand's control scheme is still pretty unique by today's standards. Besides circle being the action button, you can map your moves to any face button. Square has a unique property where you can string several moves together to build your combo. This is your main damage dealer, and what you'll use to wear down enemies until they fall into a dizzy state. I'm glossing over most of it, but the other remarkable thing about God Hand's controls is that right stick determines how Jean dodges attacks. Pressing left or right causes Jean to strafe around targets, and pressing back causes them to backflip away from danger. Pressing up causes Jean to Dempsey roll under enemy attacks, and you'd be surprised over how many attacks go straight over Jean's Dempsey rolls. Is this control scheme perfect? No, far from it. It relies on a soft target mechanic, while Jean will gravitate towards the nearest opponent, and I sometimes have to wrestle with the controls to get Jean to focus on a different target. But the game does its best to provide enough information to work around the player's limited viewpoint. You can press L1 to do a 180 turn, but the safer method that pro players recommend is to press R1 to open up the roulette wheel. You don't have to select an attack, but using this method is handy because Jean will snap to the nearest target and you can plan out your next move while the game moves in slow motion. The HUD also provides a radar that tells you each enemy's position relative to Jean's at the center. When a blip flashes red, they're attacking, and the radar even shows you when an enemy is sending out a ranged attack. Funny enough, this radar would carry over to Vanquish, but I never used it in that game. In my Fallen Order video, I had complaints over how that game, and Western action games in general, tend to have this sliding effect when it comes to attacks connecting the player and enemies. You ever play some kind of Arkham derivative and notice how everyone slides into place for whatever canned animation plays out? That's not a thing in God Hand. Sure, the movement is anything but realistic, but it's consistent. You play enough of the game, you get an idea for how far an enemy can move with a single attack, and that makes it easier to figure out how to approach each encounter. If you set up an execution or get caught by an enemy's grab, the camera cuts away to show the sequence instead of playing it out from the same in-game perspective. This prevents that sliding effect you see in other action games. When you deal enough damage to an enemy, they go into a dizzy state and you can do follow-up attacks to them that you normally wouldn't be able to do. Pressing circle will cause Jean to perform an execution on the enemy. Mashing circle stacks the damage while Jean slaps the guy around. Sometimes, It's better to do another move than the execution, but it does put you in a safe zone where enemies can't touch you while you're punishing someone. Despite how complicated the controls may seem, and the reputation the game has for being absolutely ball-busting, God Hand is actually pretty forgiving to new players. From the start, you can choose to play on either easy or normal. Easy caps the difficulty meter to level 2, and normal goes to the full spectrum warrior. When you beat the game on normal, you unlock hard, which operates like professional difficulty in RE4. The difficulty meter stays on level die, and never resets when you die. I used to think I'd get folded if I ever ended up on level die, and that was true for the early parts of the game. You can't juggle or launch basic enemies with a single attack like in the lower difficulties. Now you gotta set them up for those opportunities like a fighting game. But even when you die, the game asks if you want to start from the last checkpoint, and if you say yes, you get full health and an extra roulette charge to make the fight easier. At that point, it's just a matter of swallowing your pride and saying yes. And if a fight is just too spicy for you, you always have the option of opening up the roulette wheel and choosing to grovel to reset the difficulty meter back to level 1. A big distinguishing point between God Hand and contemporary titles like Devil May Cry or Bayonetta is that it doesn't really punish you for taking these L's. At the end of every chapter, you get a payout based on your performance. You don't take that much of a hit if you continue after a death, and the only real penalty you can incur is if you let a civilian die. You are the hero after all.
Thank you! Thank you!
Thank you.
When I started this run, I made a rule for myself to give each area my best shot and pick yes if I ever died. I broke that rule several times because I knew I could get through a fight on level die, and I wanted to see it happen. It's good to have those kinds of choices in games because you can learn the game on your own pace. Besides the built-in difficulty, players can impose their own challenges when they run the game. At the start, Olivia puts a kick me sign on Jean's back as a prank. This sign stays on Jean's model for the entire game, so long as you don't use the God Hand or God Roulette moves. Kick me runs are challenges where you only use your normal moves. I don't think I'm anywhere near that level, but that's such a cool way of imposing a challenge on the player. There's no achievement to log on in your online records. You get a visual reminder on the most visible part of the character to show that you're pulling your punches. Gameplay aside, the other standout feature in God Hand is just how funny the game is. A lot of games nowadays struggle to be funny with their writing, and usually it boils down to a 40-year-old thinking that a 20-something stringing together a bunch of cuss words is the height of comedy.
Horse balls. Big, giant, sweaty horse balls. Big, giant, sweaty, dangling horse testes just swinging in the goddamn breeze, knocking back and forth like a pair of motherfucking clappers in a giant horse flesh crotch bell.
God Hand's humor comes in two flavors: non sequitur references to pop culture, or sight gags that revel in the absurdity of the setting.
Keep on rolling.
When I cover anything from Platinum Games, I usually take time to point out as many references as I can in a video. I don't think I can do that in God Hand. It takes the piss out of everything. True to its purpose as a spite game for Final Fight, you get a map screen at the end of every chapter. Beating the boss will show Jean progressing further along the map, similar to how Final Fight would show the player passing through each district of Metro City at the end of each stage. A lot of attacks from Jean and his enemies are nods to Street Fighter and Final Fight. Sometimes you run into a Little Devil, the name of the group that developed the first Devil May Cry, and they'll give you bonus challenges for extra cash. One of the first challenges is to destroy a car within a given time limit. This is exactly like the bonus stages in Street Fighter 2 and Final Fight. Some of the bosses are digs at other Clover games like Beautiful Joe.
Douchebags.
If you take a beating from certain enemies, they'll say some interesting voice lines.
Hey, you're not Alexander. I'm brutal and ruthless. My defenses are impregnable.
These are all quotes from a Mike Tyson interview where he cuts one hell of a promo on Lennox Lewis.
I'm the best ever. I'm the most brutal and vicious and most ruthless champion there's ever been. There's no one can stop me. Lynx is a conqueror. No, I'm Alexander. He's no Alexander. I'm the best ever. There's never been anybody as ruthless. I'm Sonny Liston. I'm Jack Dempsey. There's no one like me. I'm from Nairclaw. There's no one that can match me. My style is impetuous. My defense is impregnable. And I'm just ferocious. I want your heart. I want to eat his children. Praise be to Allah.
There's this one stage where a woman is being chased by a respawning horde of enemies, and you have to toss boxes and barrels at them to keep her safe, until she can move a lever to open a path to you. This is a riff on the infamous water room in Resident Evil 4, where you have to keep Ashley safe while she turns some cranks to help you escape. Not only did God Hand take inspiration from contemporary games, it inspired future titles from both Capcom and Platinum Games, who started out as ex-Clover staff. Do you have any idea how much influence his Punch QTE with Azel has on Platinum? Capcom hasn't directly acknowledged God Hand in decades, and that's probably due to its bad reception at launch. But I swear that certain bosses in Devil May Cry 5 are partially based on Elvis's and Shannon's true forms. Also, this is Nero's Buster attack on Cavalier Angelo. During Shannon's first fight, she has a spell that can turn you into a poison chihuahua. You can't do anything but run around and avoid Shannon's attacks until you recover. Bayonetta did this with the final fight against Jubileus, and, spoiler if you haven't played Hi-Fi Rush yet, but you end up playing as your Robo-Cat buddy in the first phase of the final boss fight. Besides the pop culture riffs, what is it about God Hand's sight gags that make them funny?
You're only allowed to stop working when you're dead. You must keep working. More than one of you should be enjoying this.
For one, Mikami and Clover knew that seeing an animation sped up to a ridiculous pace is instant comedy, which is why Jean's sprint looks like that. Same goes with Jean's execution animations, and how their speed is set to half pass you can mash circle. The other thing about the gags is that the game is going for Looney Tunes logic. Jean will see the most ridiculous thing happen and go right along with it without skipping a beat. The best example is when you rescue this civilian from drowning. Thugs are throwing metal tubes at him to weigh him down, but once you beat them up,
Thank you!
Swimming a medley, huh?
Jean never looks at the camera and goes, "Well, that happened." He just takes it in stride and lets the joke play itself out. Even with this goofy encounter, the game knows how to dial it back for serious moments, but it's never expecting you to take it seriously when it can't even take itself seriously at times.
Alright, so where's next?
A floating bazaar.
Huh. I'll need a yacht.
It's not enough for a yacht, but take this.
Ah, been turning tricks, huh?
Asshole.
You would think the game's plot would be an incoherent mess with how many gags appear in every scene, but it's surprisingly straightforward. As you make your way across the map, you'll face the 4 devas and their underlings. Each area has a distinct feel that you get from the environment and the soundtrack. Masafuda Takada composed the music, and it oozes personality with each track. I've used like 3 or 4 songs from God Hand for the end credits of my videos because they're all bops. The environment art also does a lot to tell the story without spelling it out. You start the game in the rundown outskirts, and everything looks desolate and empty.
Gene, this place reeks.
I know.
I think that emptiness contributed to the bad first impression people had with the game at launch. I mean, look at the first panel of the God Hand edit. But once you get past the first 2 chapters, the levels take on new themes. Shannon runs a carnival, and her zone gets the most whimsical ska track I've ever heard. Elvis's theme has a recurring vocal effect that mimics Elvis Presley's verbal mannerisms. A standout track for me is Belze's boss theme, because it has a fluttering kind of feeling that resembles a Flight of the Bumblebee, which is appropriate considering what his true form looks like. My favorite area from a visual standpoint is the one just after Ravel's first encounter on the boat in the floating bazaar zone. You step off the boat, and you see a bridge leading to a large cathedral on the water. 2 stages later, you're pushing a metal boulder up the bridge that leads to the cathedral where Elvis's final fight takes place. Should you play God Hand? Yes, that shouldn't even be a question. But if you plan on playing it, don't feel intimidated by its reputation as the hardest action game ever. It tends to throw you in the deep end of the pool, but even the first couple of stages provide tooltips you can look at to understand the game's mechanics. Don't worry about starting on normal, or doing any self-imposed challenges at first. There's no shame in starting on easy and learning how to manage enemies at level 2. If you're worried that you don't have enough gold to get all the moves and upgrades you want, take a break from the main game and check out the casino or the fighting ring in between stages to get some cash. Once you've got a few easy playthroughs under your belt, check out Mike Hobbs' channel for tips on how to get better at the game. If you're not sure how to get God Hand, check out Sseth Tzeentach's review on the game and pay special attention to that video's description. What ended up happening to my most recent run is that I wanted to see if I could keep a loop going on bosses. I'd use a certain attack to build up tension, then I'd pop the God Hand to get a steady output of damage until I pummeled the boss. I'd repeat the cycle by using Chain Yanker to stun the boss, build up more tension, and then pummel them or pop the God Hand. Fighting bosses became a puzzle for me to figure out what attack strings I needed to link to make sure the bosses would go into a dizzy state just as my God Hand wore off. Then I'd build up more tension until I could pop the God Hand and kept the loop going. I've seen people talk about how they would love a modern remake for God Hand, and I personally do not want that. I think this game is lightning in a bottle, and trying to recreate something this unique will only result in a pale imitation. Instead, I want a remaster of the game. Keep the same visuals and the same audio, but sharpen up the textures for 4K resolution, and separate the audio channels so we have control over how we want the vocals, the sound effects, and the music will balance out. If I haven't convinced you to play God Hand yet, let me explain what happens in the final boss fight. After beating your rival for the final time, you get both God Hands and fight Angra himself.
Sorry I woke you. Don't worry, I'll tuck you back into bed.
Up until now, some bosses would summon low-level minions to fight you. Angra summons demons. They hit just as hard as it would any other time, but now that you have both God Hands, you can fold them like you would any other enemy. That is such a cool way to show how powerful you've become. Play God Hand.
May the light of good shine on his soul through these God Hands!
Got a demon, what am I? It's time for me to choose my path. The power of my God Hand, no evildoer will get past. Hand to hand or fist to fist, kick your nuts or twist your wrist. God power keeps my pimp hand strong, so trust me or you won't last very long. Dragon kick your ass into the Milky Way. Milky Way. Don't act like you don't like the Bulbasaur. My arm, my arm, my arm, my arm, my arm, my arm, the summon of the